Welcome to the Idea Climbing Podcast. If you want more sales, you have to ask more meaningful questions. I discuss how to do that in this episode with my guest, Leslie Venetz. Leslie is a globally recognized B2B sales expert, corporate trainer, and founder of the Sales-Led GTM Agency. With nearly 2 decades of experience, she specializes in modern outbound sales strategies that drive revenue, build trust, and empower sales teams to excel. As a LinkedIn editorial top voice and top 1% sales thought leader, Leslie's insights have reached over 100 million views worldwide, transforming the performance of sales leaders and their teams. We dive into topics such as why big numbers are not believable and why promising less is more when it comes to successful selling. How to successfully practice the 4 pillars of active listening. The one thing above all else that you need to do when it comes to asking meaningful questions in the sales world, and more golden nuggets of advice. You're going to love this show. Leslie, thank you for making the time to be here today. I really appreciate you.
My absolute pleasure, Mark. Thanks for inviting me.
And we're going to talk about a subject I love when it comes to sales, how entrepreneurs can ask more meaningful questions to bring their big ideas to life, not just pitch people. But before we get into the tactics, the strategies, the stories, let's start with yours. As far as that subject goes, why is that important to you? What's your story behind that subject of asking more meaningful questions?
Yeah, I did not realize that the ability to ask questions was so central to my sales success because it wasn't the thing that you're told is essential to sales success, right? Like the things that you're told are to never take no for an answer and to like grind and crush objections and all of those like cliche sales phrases. And it was probably a couple of years into my sales career and really reflecting on why I was having so much success, even though my sales style and sort of my philosophy, my approach to selling was so much different than some of my peers. And one of the things I kept coming back to was I ask a lot more questions, and the types of questions I ask weren't just qualifying questions or sort of the superficial, what's keeping you up at night questions. I was going much deeper. And once I realized that that was, sort of a sales superpower for me, it's something I've continued to invest in and practice as a skill so I can be even better at creating really meaningful conversations with my buyers.
I love that you said go deeper. Unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by going deeper with questions?
Yeah. So I was a bit of a nerd, a geek, and I mean this in the most positive light ever, in middle school, high school, college. And I was, a varsity policy debater. Like my weekends were spent on stage winning awards for policy debate. Later, I did Model Arab League and Model UN. I was the president of our college MUN group for a handful of years. So I'd spent a tremendous amount of time practicing rhetoric. I did not know that it was a sales skill, but I was, in fact, accidentally practicing the exact foundation that it takes to be hugely successful in sales. And what that means is that if you are doing a policy debate or a Model United Nations round, you can't just ask what's keeping you up at night and then move on to something else. Like that would never work to be able to have the type of focused conversation. And in that context, you have to pull the evidence or you have to create the reports. But in sales, it's nice to know that somebody, for instance, is worried about budgets. But if you can create a dynamic where you have the privilege of asking, say, 2 or 3 more questions, what you might uncover is that it's not that they're just worried about budgets. They're worried that if they don't hit their budget numbers, that might require them to lay off some of their staff. And so what's really causing the pain and what they really want to solve for isn't a little bit of ROI. It is to avoid laying off one of their, staff members, all of whom they worked with for 5 years. So I found that ability to ask meaningful follow-up questions that allow you to go deep and uncover not just a superficial sort of pain that they're giving you, but really that that thing that is going to cause them to want to put the time and effort and budget into solving for a problem now instead of later,
Mhm.
it makes all the difference.
What type of questions do you ask? That's interesting to go from, oh, you're going to get a 200% ROI, but they really care about laying people off. What's the bridge between, oh, that there's a 200% ROI and, oh, you don't want to lay people off? What does a discussion like that entail?
Yeah, three things immediately come to mind. One is focusing on cost of inaction over ROI language. One is indexing on open-ended questions instead of a close-ended questions. And then I would say the third one is practicing active listening as a skill.
Mhm.
So I can kind of run through all of those concepts. When we think about COI or cost of inaction language, what we need to keep in mind, Mark, is that we as humans, all of us, have an extremely difficult time picturing future gains. And so salespeople tend to default to ROI language. We are going to 2 times your revenue. We are in my inbox. Half of my inbox is, what would it mean to you if I could get you 30 more meetings a month? And I'm like, it would mean that I would cry myself to sleep at night. I'd be so overwhelmed. Like, what? But we tend to focus on like more, more, more. More is a much more difficult way to sell people on taking action than cost of inaction language. And cost of inaction language is going to be helping them avoid pain. So it's a balancing act. You don't want to come at people too hard and only do cost of inaction language. And so the way I think about it, or the way I coach my clients when we're working on sales messaging is having a blend of pain and gain messaging. So how can we help them avoid the pain and clearly illustrate that? And
Mhm.
then we're going to tell them what is that outcome, what is the gain at the end. But I found that to be extremely valuable when we are tracking from sort of what is the kind of superficial thing. We save time, we save
Mhm.
money, we reduce risk to what really matters. That's sort of on the front end when we think about sales messaging. So I'll stop there for a second before I go on.
With sales messaging, would you say from what you just mentioned about like, oh, I'll 30x or I'll get you 30 new meetings, is there a point where less is actually more in situations like that?
Yes, because big numbers are not believable.
Mm.
And also, specificity creates credibility and creates believability. This guy, Todd Capone, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he had, oh my gosh, he has a book. I have both of his books actually on my shelf right now. And he has one called The Transparency Sale. And at the time, he was working for Rapid Ratings, I think was the name of the company, and that their data showed that accounts with it was like a 4.7 to 4.8 out of 5 got significantly more traction than accounts with a 5 out of 5
Hmm.
because it seemed less believable. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's a 5 out of 5. Nobody gets it 100% right all of the time. So making these big grandiose promises, you as the seller might think it looks really appealing, but you're setting off those sort of subconscious red flags in your prospect's brain that there's something wrong because nobody can actually be that perfect or deliver that level of results. So it does not pay to like have the most moonshot stats out there ever. And also it does not pay to have like generic like 100 times or number one.
Mhm.
Instead, lead with something that's much more specific because that will be more memorable, more credible, more believable.
And you had started down the road as far as you. I think you mentioned there's a couple other ways as far as going deeper and having more meaningful conversations because you're
Yeah.
asking meaningful questions. What go on with that?
I gotta tell you, one of the simplest ways is using open-ended questions. And as I know, it's one of those simple but not easy pieces of advice that I give, Mark. And I will tell you as a brand new seller, and I'm going to date myself a little bit here because this was back at the time where we didn't have all the fancy like apps and sales tech we have now. I didn't have like a call conversational recording tool. And I literally wrote like who, what, when, where, which, how, why on a piece of paper and I taped it to my phone So I would be in the middle of like, asking a question, do you agree? And I would say, how do you think that would apply at insert company name? And so I really had to retrain my brain and retrain the way I communicated because it's different than how we talk to our friends and family and our colleagues.
Mhm.
Right? We ask a lot more close-ended questions in regular life. And so it does take a little bit of practice to index higher on open-ended questions. And what I would add to that is be careful that the questions that you ask are not all qualifying questions because that is not going to help you go deeper. So it's not that those aren't important. You have to get that information about who else is part of the decision-making committee and what the budget cycle and the timing looks like. But my suggestion is to hold some of that for later in the call
Mhm.
and earlier in your communication, your dialogue with buyers. Make sure that you are asking open-ended questions that really focus on the problems that they're solving or the jobs to be done. So it's a simple but not easy piece of advice for sellers. Ask more open-ended questions.
Well, I think so many of us and people listening, watching are entrenched in the traditional, whether you learned it in college or you didn't even go to college, but you're reading all of the New York Times best-selling books. You said something interesting. You said you retrained your brain. For someone that's entrenched in the old school and they're like, wait a second, I like your way better. How did you retrain your brain? What advice do you have for doing that when things can get so just solidified over the years?
It's actually a perfect segue to the third point around active listening. So I love this question because if we asked somebody to learn how to shoot free throws, to learn how to code, if we asked somebody to learn a skill like that, they would immediately know that it would take a lot of practice, right?
Yep.
But when we think about soft skills, we often fall into a default assumption that there's something we either have or we don't have. And so, what I would challenge everybody listening, everybody everywhere, is to remember that soft skills are skills, just like hard skills, like learning how to shoot free throws or learning how to code, which means that they require intentional and deliberate practice.
Mhm.
And so, I will use active listening as an example. I teach a 4R framework for active listening. The first R is reinforce, which are just those like verbal and nonverbal cues to indicate that you want the person to keep speaking. The second is resist. And that's the meaty part. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Then we restate to make sure we get it right. And then the last step is the first time we really start speaking and it's relevance. And that's our opportunity to make sure that we are asking relevant, open-ended questions, right? The concepts all kind of stack. But I highlight resist because that is where the practicing of active listening as a skill set comes in. Often when folks hear active listening, they think, oh, my job is just to not interrupt. But it's so, so, so much more than that. You are resisting the temptation, and tell me if any of these feel maybe relatable. You are resisting the temptation to rent space in your head to whatever you're going to say next. I think that's a really, really big one. Most of the time, we are listening to respond, not listening to understand. So we
Mhm.
just are then kind of waiting for our turn to speak instead of really being cued in on what the person is saying. Really often in sales, I see that we need to resist the temptation to judge or to assume. And I don't mean judge in like a judgmental way. How I see that come up is that sellers have heard the same question, the same problem, the same, goal over and over and over again. And so they either sort of stop listening or stop asking those follow-up questions because they just assume that they know what the answer
Mhm.
is, or instead of taking the time to really understand what the buyer is trying to communicate, they jump into helper mode. And I
Okay.
use the phrase helper really specifically because my experience is that sellers are excited. They hear something and they're like, oh my gosh, I know the answer. I can help you solve that. I've helped other people solve that. And they jump in really early and start trying to offer insights and solutions. But what it feels like to the buyer is that they're jumping into sales mode because we simply have not done enough of that practice of active listening to build enough trust, to build enough rapport to have earned the right to start offering solutions. And I would say the last area around resist, and I'll be vulnerable for a moment here and share with folks that this is where I struggled the most as I have worked hard to master this skill set, and I'm still on the journey, is resisting the temptation to try to share your own relatable story as a way to communicate to the speaker that you understand what they are trying to share with you. It's a shortcut. So instead of actually doing the work to understand, I stop listening and I start talking, and I start talking about myself and my own experiences as a way to like cheat the system and try to get them to believe that I understand instead of doing the work to understand. So it's a lot bigger like than you would assume, right? Resist the temptation to interrupt, but it's a lot more than that. And so those are all different areas of active listening that a person could practice if they wanted to, really flex that muscle more.
So many people talk about, I mean, storytelling, and you have to tell stories, and you touched on it, to be relatable, you have to share a story about yourself. Two things. If you're not supposed to do what you just said by sharing your story too quickly, what do you do instead? And we'll start there. What do you do instead of sharing a story about yourself, or how do you know when to? Because so many
Yeah.
people, that's just like 101, tell stories.
You wait until relevance. So that is a deeply important part of sales communication. But having listened to literally thousands of sales calls, gosh, if I include cold calls, tens of thousands, folks do it too early, and they do it in place of taking the time to truly understand. So, my recommendation is first, just don't jump into storytelling mode too soon until you are absolutely sure that the story you're going to tell is appropriate for the
Hmm.
situation. And that's why I say hold it back for relevance, because often what I will hear on calls is that AEs will start using storytelling, or like I heavily teach voice of customer storytelling. And so they're using the right technique, they're just using it at the wrong time. They'll jump into the storytelling. And again, what it feels like to the buyer is that you are being a high pressure salesperson instead of sharing a helpful story. So the technique is a great technique. We love storytelling. We love voice of customer. But my advice to folks that are maybe struggling with when to use it is resist the temptation to tell stories before you've asked enough questions to be 100% sure that the story you're going to tell is relevant to what the buyer has tried to communicate to you.
Well, when someone gets into the four parts of it, they understand that what we're talking about now. What ways, after you get past, maybe even unlearn old stuff, learn new stuff, what things can you do to hone your skills after you start doing ask questioning done the right way? What ways can you hone your skills over time to stay sharp?
I think meditation is at the top of my list, which I'm guessing is not the answer that you expected me to give. But if we think about why active listening is so hard,
Mm.
it's because it's extraordinarily difficult to focus, right?
Yeah, a
And
little
in
bit.
order to practice active listening, we have to stay 100% focused, just locked in on the person that is speaking. And we live in a world of distraction. We live in a world that is constantly fighting for our divided focus. And I say that to illustrate that if somebody's listening and they are thinking, gosh, I do really struggle to pay attention to somebody when they're speaking, even for a couple of minutes at a time, or like, gosh, right now, listening to you, I've realized I've already started multitasking, Leslie. I get it. I get it. That is sort of the way of the world that we work in. And to counterbalance that, I think that we have to take proactive measures to train our brain for extended focus. And meditation is a way, it's the easiest way that I have found to do that. Even if it's 10 minutes every single morning, it really helps.
So when you're questioning people, how do you balance everything we said so far? You get into it, you hone your craft a little bit. How do you balance what you're going to say next with listening to them? Because at some point you do have to prepare a question to have a two-way conversation. But where's that balance between too much prep in my head versus active listening to what they're saying? How do you balance those two?
I would push back on that a little bit.
Mhm.
I don't think that you have to prepare a question, and I think that that's where we get into trouble on sales conversations. You in this interview totally have to prepare a question, or else it would be a very awkward flow. But in sales conversations, one of the like hottest tips that I give brand new sellers who are maybe new to a product is to repeat back what the person just said in the form of a question if they're really struggling with what to ask next. So instead of renting space in your head or like totally being distracted with, oh my gosh, I need to ask a question, I need to sound smart, and what am I going to ask this person so that like they think I know what I'm doing, I would just really listen deeply and then take a few words of what they just said and repeat it back as a question. And so that might sound like, let's say, they're really struggling with compliance management. It could be as simple as compliance management, really struggling.
Oh my gosh.
It could be that simple. Or one of my favorite tricks, trick doesn't sound right. One of my favorite ways to reframe questions for reps that are new to a product, new to a company, is adding what does that look like at, and then their specific company name in there. So whatever they say, maybe they're like, oh, everybody, it's all hands on deck because some new compliance mandates came out. And you can say, how do those compliance mandates impact company? Or let me give you another example. I spent a lot of years working at selling directly to chief procurement officers. And one of the big issues that came up across all companies was like supply chain woes. And so if I wasn't quite sure what they were trying to communicate, and they shared something, something, all this fancy language about supply chain, and I'm not a supply chain expert, so I don't know what they're saying, I would just ask, and what does that look like at, and then insert their company name.
Nice.
And so it's right, you don't need to be preparing another question to be able to ask those types of follow-ups. You just need to default to open-ended questions and really make sure that you're active listening so that you can take whatever they're sharing with you and then ask them to go a little bit deeper.
That is awesome. And we have covered a lot of ground in a fairly short period of time. When it comes to sales, selling your big idea, selling whatever it is that it happens to be, and asking more meaningful questions, and I dare to say, to get even more meaningful and better results. Someone's watching or listening, is like, I heard a lot of good stuff. If you were to say, you know what, if you're going to do this, at least do this one thing. At least do this. What would you tell people to do when it comes to asking meaningful questions?
It has to go back to active listening. And my call to action would be train yourself to listen to understand instead of listening to respond.
That is excellent. And if people want to find you online, where's the best place or places to go?
Yes. Well, Mark, my debut book drops here in just a couple of weeks on August 5. So if folks want to check out the book where I share a lot of this wisdom in more depth, they can do that at salesledgtm.com/book. Tried to keep that simple. So yeah, just my website, salesledgtm.com/book, or I live on LinkedIn. I'm a chronically online person, and LinkedIn is the place where I publish content and drop sales knowledge every single day. So you can find me there.
Thank you again, Leslie. I appreciate you making the time.
Thank you so much. This was great.
And scene.